Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're in the middle of races for city council across Ontario, actually in some other provinces as well. Who's running for city council is an issue in a lot of places. And Steve LeFleur, who is a public policy expert, recently wrote a column that I found really quite interesting. It's "Why doesn't anyone want to run for city council?" Why doesn't anyone want to run for city council? Roughly 1/3 fewer people will run for Toronto City Council than in 2018, according to Steve LeFleur. Steve is a public policy analyst, as I said, with over a decade of experience working at various different think tanks. And I've had the pleasure of interviewing him before on things related to the housing crisis in Ontario. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
This article was in something called Hub, which is the hub.ca, which is, I understand, a place for people like you to publish interesting opinion pieces. And yours was pretty hard-hitting, that you're suggesting that there's something wrong with municipal government that causes less people to want to run for it. Tell us what your argument is, sir.
Yeah, well, I mean, the numbers don't lie. 1/3 fewer people running for city council is a big decline. It's also notable because there are a lot of prominent incumbents who decided not to run. There are 3 of them who didn't run, obviously, because they were elected to provincial parliament, or provincial legislature. So that's fair. But there were also a number who just walked away for no particular reason, which in and of itself is a bit of a warning sign. You think city council is a pretty safe long-term job. Toronto doesn't tend to vote out incumbents. So when you've got not only people walking away, but not that many people running to replace them, it's a bit of a warning sign. And it's a pretty high-profile job. Usually when high-profile political offices come open, people are pretty eager to run for them, but not this time.
You argue that the compensation might be one of the issues, and you say the councillor salaries are in the same ballpark as TTC route supervisors and signal technicians.
Yeah, so $100,000 or I think it's 118. I don't remember. I don't have the number off the top of my head. It sounds like a lot of money, and at one point in time it was. But in the city of Toronto now, that's not really any kind of luxurious salary, given the escalating cost of living. If you're going to attract people from well-paying and stable private sector jobs, it's really hard to do it with, maybe just meeting what they were making in the private sector. It's a lot to ask somebody to say, okay, well, take time off your job if you can, and run for office. And, if you get elected, you'll make the same money you were making before. That doesn't exactly sound like a big prize.
You also argue that we could make the job of municipal politicians more interesting by giving them more control over what they actually are faced with. Tell us about that.
Yeah, over time, I think that city council has kind of become the Bush League, or at least that's the perception. Increasingly, people look to the provincial and federal governments to solve issues that have been traditionally municipal issues. So if you're, a rising star in politics, are you going to run for city council, or are you just going to say, Queen's Park is really calling the shots on transportation decisions, so why don't I just, go and play for the big league team? Which is problematic for a number of reasons, but it certainly means that a lot of people just are skipping the normal step. I think it's kind of problematic that historically there's been a bit of a pipeline where people run for school board because that's their springboard to running for city council, which is their springboard for running for provincial or federal government. I've never been a big fan of that, but at least it meant that when people used to do that we got those talented people, for a while before they decided to go and run for federal or provincial office. So now, instead of having that kind of farm team system, where we get, rising stars on city council for a while, like Jack Layton or, the Fords, for instance, ran Toronto for a while. Now you just kind of get whoever's left over. The biggest examples right now are in the last provincial election, we had Stephen Del Duca and Andrea Horwath, who were leaders of two provincial parties, and now they're running for mayor of their towns. It's like a backup plan now. Similar thing in Brampton. Remember, John Tory was also a leader of the provincial PCs. So there's this interesting trend where all of a sudden it's becoming, where people who fell off the political ladder end up, and that's not really healthy.
Well, in Milton and in Mississauga, there were city councillors that ran provincially, lost, and are back running for their jobs they never had to quit.
Yeah. I tend to think of local government as really important. It's where the rubber hits the road for most people. When you think about people's interaction with government, most of it is with the city government, like everything from paving the roads to making sure the train runs on time to picking up garbage. But it just has become an afterthought for a lot of people politically. And I think that's a problem, because we ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to have good municipal services. And, part of that is having the right people in place, doing good oversight and proposing good ideas. And, it doesn't seem like a lot of people are very interested in that at the moment.
We're chatting tonight with Stephen LeFleur, who is a senior public policy analyst with over a decade of experience working at various different think tanks about city politics and running for city councils, and an article that he's recently written in the hub.ca called "Why Doesn't Anyone Want to Run for City Council?" Roughly 1/3 fewer people will run for Toronto City Council this year than in 2018. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Steve in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight that we're talking about is city councils across Ontario. October, I think it's the 24th, we're going to be electing new city governments in every city in Ontario, and there's municipal elections coming up across the country. As I've traveled the country, I've seen signs in lots of different places. Frankly, there's a provincial election going on in Quebec right now, where I think some of the same impacts are occurring. Stephen LeFleur is my guest. He's recently written an article in the hub.ca, which is an online media outlet for public policy people to write interesting articles. And it's about why no one wants to run for city council and how 1/3 less people are running for city council today than in the past. Steve, let me ask you a couple of questions, if I could, about your argument. Some people think that one of the reasons why incumbents have so much power in city governments, in city elections, is because you don't end up having political parties, and you end up having 10, 15, 20 people running. And so therefore, the attention gets completely spread out amongst too many different people. And so therefore, having less people run will allow more attention to the few people that are running and will make incumbency less powerful. So it would be actually the opposite of your argument, that having less people run, take it to the ultimate extreme of actually having political parties, and so therefore you've only got 3 to 4 to 5 people running, might make the power of incumbency less powerful. Does that make any sense?
Sure. Well, so first off, the number of people running for city council isn't inherently good or bad. Whether it's, if you have 2 serious candidates versus if you have 1 serious candidate and 4 people who just put their name down, like having 2 serious competitors is more of a competitive election. So the raw numbers are an indicator, but they're not the whole story, certainly. The party thing is interesting. It's something that I wouldn't have necessarily supported in the past, but I've become more sympathetic to one of my friends who's actually a longtime political operative, wrote a piece actually following up on mine, in which he made the argument that municipal parties might be helpful because of things like, having access to shared voters lists and fundraising and having operations outside of election periods. And it's certainly something to think about. They do it in Vancouver, they do it in Montreal. And I would say that by having a party, you are able to tell more of a story and have more of a vision about what you want to do with the city, and potentially have more of an ability to execute on it. In Montreal with Projet Montréal, they've certainly been able to execute on a lot of priorities. So I'm sympathetic to the idea. I don't necessarily have a strong opinion on it, but I do think it is something to think about. But at the same time, there are a lot of things you could do that don't necessarily require doing that, just in terms of making the job more appealing and ensuring that city council offices can be more effective.
You know, I'm interested. You also have an argument in your piece about the strong mayors effort that Premier Ford has recently talked about for Toronto and Ottawa and potentially extending to other cities. Do you like the idea of strong mayors?
It's hard to say precisely. It's one of those things that could end up being somewhat beneficial. I think part of the challenge is that there are some things that they've delegated to the mayors that the province could have just done themselves. You know, one of the premises of the idea is that it'll make it easier for provincial or municipal governments to get housing built by being able to align with provincial policy, when I think that the province could just impose these things instead of having kind of like a Rube Goldberg machine where they hope that the, you know, outcome is what they intend. There are some potential benefits to it. I mean, mayors are the most high-profile members of city council, obviously, but unlike in a lot of parts of, say, the United States, they're not quite as powerful. So maybe making it a more meaningful job might be helpful, and it might allow for a more effective municipal government. But it's really hard to say. I think we'll have to wait to actually see and evaluate. But certainly, city councils aren't, in many respects, don't run as well as one would hope. And one potential solution is to have, you know, the mayor really in charge of running city council. So we'll see. It's something I'm open to again, but I think that you can look at reforms in two buckets. You can look at reforms in, you know, kind of big structural reforms, which that would be one of them, but also there are a lot of day-to-day things just to make the job better and to make the job more effective that I think you could do as well.
So I thought it was a little bit ironic when Premier Doug Ford announced the idea of super mayors. He said that you know, it was surprising that John Tory, even though he was elected by the whole city, only had one vote and had the same voting power on city council as a council person that was elected only by one ward. But the ironic thing is that Doug Ford only has one vote. Justin Trudeau has only one vote. And what gives them the power, the superpower of being premier or being prime minister, is that they're leader of a party. And it's the party that effectively gives them that power. Is it not? You know, I guess there's things about being deemed the premier or the prime minister. And so therefore they get to appoint cabinet ministers. But you know, again, it's the fact that they've got one vote. They're elected as either an MPP in Etobicoke or in Montreal, and it's the party that gives them the power. And so, therefore, again, wouldn't municipal parties be a way of effectively making mayors the leaders of those municipal parties, super mayors, without actually having any provincial government granting them those powers?
Yeah, and you know, one way to look at it is maybe this first step on that path, by making the mayor more formally, you know, the head of city council. Maybe that will lead in that direction, because you could see how it would be attractive for say, for instance, if somebody wanted to run a slate of councillors. Something I'm a little surprised nobody's actually tried, you know. But I think that, you know, that way you would have a more cohesive approach, and you could have voters know exactly what they're voting for at their local city council level, as you alluded to before. So certainly it could go in that direction. And, you know, maybe that's what's needed. I like the idea of having, you know, local city councillors who are independent and who come from their own perspective and represent precisely what their constituents want. But on the other hand, sometimes that leads to trouble, because it means that they're thinking just of their ward. And B, you know, as you pointed out, sometimes that just means people don't really exactly know what candidates stand for, because it's just one little, you know, race, whereas the mayor's race gets all the attention, even if they're just one vote on council.
And one of the challenges, if there isn't a competitive mayor race, which in Toronto it looks this year like there may not be a competitive mayor race, turnout goes down dramatically. And then there's even less less attention paid to the different council races and less of a vote. And some people would argue it's almost impossible to unseat an incumbent.
Yeah, I mean, in any election where you have multiple candidates on the ballot, if the highest profile position isn't really competitive, then that certainly makes it harder for people to get attention down ballot. So that certainly could be a concern. I mean, I don't know whether the provincial or municipal election will be competitive. It's hard to say. I mean, the main competitor does have a profile. Whether that's enough to make him competitive, who knows? But if it's not a competitive race, certainly I think that would make it much harder for people running for council to get any attention. Gosh,
I think I'm a political junkie. I don't even know who the main competitor is. Who's the main competitor?
Gil Penderosa. He's an urbanist author. He's certainly well known and liked in urbanist circles, but I don't know. It's hard for me to say whether that translates into the potential for a high profile race. Is it just that people like me know who he is and what he stands for, or is it going to resonate further? It's really hard for me to say.
So I know Gil well, and I've interviewed him, and I think his 8 to 80s association is an excellent organization, but he certainly doesn't have, I would have thought, the profile of Jennifer Keesmaat or gosh, I can't even remember her name right now, Olivia Chow, who have faced off against our current mayor in Toronto previously.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the flip side of that is maybe not having a long political track record might be an advantage. Olivia Chow obviously, was affiliated with a political party, and that obviously for some people might be a downside. Who knows? I do think it's really tough to get traction in a short race. I mean, this thing might be over before many people really know his name, depending on how things go. But yeah, it certainly might be the case that it won't be competitive. And that would be a loss, I think, because I think that voters deserve to have an election that raises some important ideas and that presents contrasting visions. We'll see. Hopefully we get that.
Some people think that part of the problem is just the way we elect as well. So political parties have been one of the issues. Another suggestion that there's a big organization in Toronto that talks about it is having a preferential vote, which would be comparable to the way the Conservatives elected their leader, which is that you go in and you vote for who your first choice is, but you also have an opportunity to vote for your second, third, fourth choice. And you wait into successive counts until such time as one person gets over 50.1 or gets over 50%, gets at least 50.1% of the vote. Do you think that preferential vote process would be wise?
I think it's certainly something to be considered. I mean, I know that if I remember correctly, the province kind of stamped that out, but I think Mississauga was it that wanted to do that. You would probably know better than I would. But there was a municipality that wanted to do it, and I believe they were told they couldn't. I think there's something to it, the idea of making sure that at least somebody tolerable to 50% of the population will win versus somebody who can, get a third of the vote in a competitive race. Now, that's not really the way that the dynamics are going to shape up, since there are only going to be probably at most 2 competitive candidates in this election. But as a general principle, I think that there's something to that. The idea that at least somebody who, is maybe the first and second choice, or first or second choice of half the population is probably something to think about, and might make it easier for, candidates who are more down the middle to win, which might be a good thing, because, if you're trying to win 40% of the vote versus 50% of the vote, you might run in a different way.
I interviewed Joe Berridge, who's head of an organization called Urban Strategies. He's one of the, most well thought of urban planner strategists in Ontario, Canada, and frankly around the world. He said that the problem is that the ward councillors are elected not in parties and just for wards, and so therefore very myopic in their views and what they're worried about, only worried about what's going to get them elected or unelected in that local ward rather than things that impact the whole city. which would be different than an MPP or an MP that are part of a party that, or maybe even a cabinet, and also therefore obviously impacted by what is impacting the whole province or country. His recommendation is to change our system and have all of the councillors elected citywide, or as some cities would do, elect them in regions. So you've got 3 or 4 people elected for North Toronto, West Toronto, something like that. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, well, first of all, if I'm not mistaken, that's how they do things in Vancouver, I believe. I think they're at large. I might be wrong. But there are places where they do, at-large elections, where it means that they're running citywide instead of at the ward level. There's something to be said for that, because one of the challenges with local councillors is, as you pointed out, they can be myopic, which lends itself to development decisions. For instance, maybe you support more housing in theory, but it'd be better if it was in somebody else's ward. So that certainly can be a problem. But it's hard for me to say. There aren't that many at-large city councils, and there's always different variables you have to think about. Toronto's a giant city, as the mega city certainly means that you've got different regions to think about. So yes, maybe if you wanted to do it, you would have to do it at a regional level. But the thing is, there aren't that many. It's not like an experiment that you can run. It's not like we've got 100 cities doing different things that are all pretty comparable, and we can say, it worked here, didn't work here, here's why. So, you have to be careful about big structural changes, but at the same time, we certainly want to be open-minded about it.
I was interested, 4 years ago, there was some thought for a while of electing the regional chairs directly. Some people think that the regions are where all the power is today, not in the actual municipalities. At least this is the 905 and the rest of Ontario, not necessarily Toronto, obviously, because it's already been amalgamated. Toronto effectively is what was the region. Because police and social services and housing and a lot of the planning issues on a big scale for sewage, water, et cetera, are done on a regional basis rather than just the local city issues. For an example, Patrick Brown was rumored to be one of the people very interested in running for the regional chair in Peel. Frank Scarpitti, the mayor of Markham, was speaking about running for the regional chair of York, as was Mawitsia Bakwalaka, the then current mayor of Vaughan. But then Premier Ford backtracked and ruled that out and said no, regional chairs had to be elected by the council, the regional council, not direct. Even though in some places like Halton, they still remain to be elected directly. What do you think of that? Should regional chairs be elected directly or by the councils?
Well, I think that there are some arguments for it. I think one of the things you want to avoid, though, is a situation where there's unclear accountability. I think that if you've got a situation where the roles and responsibilities are very clear, it can be useful. What I think you don't want is a situation where nobody really knows who to hold accountable for these things. When there's overlap, it often becomes unclear. For instance, this happens between provincial and municipal and federal governments as well. You look at polling about issues in various elections, and things like public transit will sometimes pop up in federal elections, and then you have to ask yourself, are we really going to be able to hold people accountable if nobody really knows who's in charge of things?
We're chatting tonight with Stephen LeFleur. We're talking about municipal politics, and the problem that he has outlined is that 1/3 as many people are running for Toronto City Council as ran in the last election. And he indicates that he thinks that is a major issue, indicating that people are less interested in municipal politics and we need to do something about it. It's, I think, a very fascinating and a real problem that we've got. We're going to take a break for some messages and back in 2 minutes with Stephen LeFleur. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is municipal politics, and is it less interesting today? Are there problems with it such that few people are interested in running? or fewer people are interested in running. And we end up getting, as Stephen LeFleur, a senior public policy analyst who's written recently in the hub.ca about this topic, says we end up getting the farm team running our city governments rather than the first class team. And I think that is primarily an issue because, as Stephen also outlines, municipal governments are responsible for some of the things that impact us the most, whether they be housing or planning issues, police, fire, etc., getting us our water, etc. Stephen, you argue that having former provincial party leaders and frankly, in lots of cases, former provincial and federal MPs and MPPs running for municipal politics when they lose at the higher level is a negative. And it's sort of like a farm team. And you indicate that Stephen Del Duca is running to be mayor of Vaughan and Andrew Horwath is running to be mayor of Hamilton, that our current mayor in Toronto is John Tory, who used to be leader of the Progressive Conservative Party provincially, and he lost there. And I could give you other examples, obviously. In both Mississauga and Milton, as I pointed out, there's city councillors that both ran in the last provincial election that was just in June, lost, and are now running back for the seats that they currently hold, even though just 2 months ago they had effectively said, I don't want this, I want a different job. And now they're saying, well, because I didn't get that different job, I'm back for my current job. Is that good, or does that indicate that it's a farm team?
Well, I was actually a little bit less kind than that, to be honest. I think that traditionally, municipal government has been kind of like a farm team, where you get up and coming candidates who are eventually gunning to be, Jack Layton, for instance. And there were problems with that. But now it's kind of like one of those Eastern European hockey teams where, somebody who didn't quite make it in the NHL goes, to serve out their twilight years.
Oh my God, it's not even a farm team, and it's an Eastern European hockey league.
Yeah, you think about poor Jaromir Jagr at 48 years old, kind of like trying to hold up his team in the Czech Republic, because it's hard to get anybody to play there. Is that really how you want to run a professional hockey team? Probably not. But that's how we're running city councils here. It's whoever can't quite make it for provincial government, or maybe somebody who's a federal MP and, sees better prospects, at the local level. I don't think that's necessarily healthy. There's nothing inherently wrong with somebody saying, I'd rather be mayor than minister of transportation or something like that. But that doesn't really seem to be what's happening. It's not people who have prospects and say, this is actually a better job. It's more people who say, I've capped out, or I can't even get elected. And that's not necessarily a great sign for how attractive municipal government is right now.
And for an Andrew Horwath or Stephen Del Duca, is it because they can't get another job, or is it because they're going there to work for a couple of years before they make another tack at it?
It's hard to say. I guess with hindsight, we'll see. And I don't want to say that nobody should be allowed to do this or anything like that, or that it's always bad. But it seems to me that when you've got 4 high-profile cases of this in two of the largest cities in the province, and Barrie's also pretty large too. So you've got all these cases. And you have to say, maybe this pattern is a problem. Maybe individually these aren't problems, but as a pattern, if all you're getting is old party leaders running for things, then, that's maybe not the greatest situation.
But is it because of this power of the name, whether it be incumbency or just name awareness, because you don't have political parties, because you don't have easily identifiable different policies that you can, the media can analyze people, and the electorate can understand about the candidates, they end up just voting for a name they recognize. And if Stephen Del Duca or Andrew Horwath or John Tory have run provincially before, Patrick Brown, the name. And so you're just going to vote for the name. And so that name awareness becomes so critically important. And when you think about the ability to raise money, that you can't start raising in municipal politics until you actually register formally and announce, and there's a limit as to the earliest you can register, which I think was May, and you can't actually start raising money until then, unlike provincial or federal politics where you can raise money forever effectively. And how can someone new get their name out there without being able to raise money early, without being part of a political party, without being able to clearly in this noisy media landscape, get people to understand what your policies are? It's pretty challenging.
I agree with every word of that. What I will say, though, is that this has always been the case. The fact that name recognition really drives electoral prospects certainly has always been the case. I think what's changed, though, is that the job's gotten worse. From a cost of living perspective, the salaries the city councilors draw in Toronto isn't necessarily amazing. You think about these marathon city council meetings they have to sit through where they deal with mundane issues that frankly shouldn't even really necessarily get to the council level, like housing permitting and stuff like that. You also think about it's become kind of less attractive in general to be a politician lately. You think about the confrontation, with Chrystia Freeland. You think about some of the things that Singh has gone through, for instance. And politicians really have to deal with a lot of vitriol that they didn't necessarily have to not so long ago. So I don't think that helps. I think, as a package, it's just become less attractive to be a politician, and particularly a municipal politician, since you don't get the high profile. You get all the annoyance, but not the high profile.
But how do you change all that?
Well, that's not easy. I think that part of it has to be a mindset change from people who, are seeking office. Maybe they need to see an opportunity in municipal government and really think about, what they can achieve through doing so. Part of it, I think, needs to be a change in attitude, in general. I think that there's a lot of anger out there that is understandable. We've been through an unprecedented several years now. It's understandable that a lot of people are, on edge and not necessarily that happy at their elected officials. But, I think we need to move past it. I think we need to take the volume down a little bit and, maybe think a little bit more about, make it less personal and think a little bit more about what's on offer as opposed to, who we're mad at. So
Premier Ford, 4 years ago, again, said that Toronto City Council was unwieldy, particularly given that there weren't political parties with so many council members, and he halved the number of council members by making the number of council members equal to the amount of federal ridings, which effectively halved the number of council members. Also made the boundaries the same, such that people ended up having a little bit more of a potentially community feel because the provincial, federal, and municipal riding boundaries were the same. In Mississauga, in Brampton, we have twice as many council members as ridings. Should we follow the same logic and half the number of council members?
I don't have a strong opinion on what the size of council should be, but I do think that it's important to recognize that smaller boundaries mean larger boundaries mean you represent more people. They compensated for that to an extent in Toronto by doubling council budgets, but I don't think that if you're having the same number of responsibilities, but also doubling the number of people that you're representing, I think that that's a challenge. Now, I think that could be mitigated. For instance, I think if you uploaded some planning decisions, which I think that they probably should, you could take away a lot of the day-to-day irritations, frankly, that city councils have to deal with, and make it a more board level kind of job where you're setting out kind of the vision for the city as opposed to deciding on specifics. But if you just increase the number of people that are represented by a councillor, that certainly does make it more challenging.
So then let me take you the other way. Some people comment that Niagara Falls has the same population as one ward in Mississauga. So one ward in Mississauga will have one ward councillor. The same population in Niagara Falls has something like 8 councillors and a mayor. So is big good or small good?
I don't really have a good answer for that. I do think in a big city like Toronto, though, at post-amalgamation, I do think that we should think a little bit about whether we want to have some sort of more localized representation, like borough chiefs or something like that. Because ultimately it's such a giant and unwieldy city that there are a lot of local decisions that people are just too far away from. Somebody who's, a city councilor in Etobicoke might not necessarily have the same insight into, a small issue in, a part of East Toronto or something like that. And it's true that you've got local representation that helps, but at the same time, when you're thinking about citywide votes on things that might impact one area or another, it's harder the bigger the city is, because then you've got people who are further away from the issues.
But isn't that the same in federal politics and provincial politics?
Yes, it is, which is part of the reason why I think you need to be careful about how you allocate responsibility over things. For instance, one of my longtime pet peeves is the way that public transportation projects are funded. So capital projects are funded by, generally speaking, 3 levels of government. So essentially, if you want to build a subway extension in Toronto, you need to get alignment between the federal, provincial, and municipal government. And you have to ask yourself, does somebody in Grand Prairie, Alberta, or somebody in, Hearst, Ontario, have really good insight into what a good use of money is for public transit projects in Toronto? Probably not. Why would they? I don't know what a good use of capital budgeting would be in Halifax, because I don't live there. So why would I? So I think that aligning responsibilities with, people who have more insight is probably better.
Okay, but you don't need to get the federal or provincial government's involvement for any reason other than money. And the reason why you need to get them for money is because, for whatever reason, we haven't given the local governments, municipalities, taxing power equivalent to what they're mandated to provide. So would you support giving the municipal governments far greater taxing power? One argument that the former mayor of Toronto, Miller, recommended was to add 1% back to the GST or HST today and give that to city governments. Does that make any sense?
Well, I'd say it's half the problem. So one half the problem is that municipal governments don't have the tools to raise certain revenue, or don't have certain tools to raise revenue. The other half of it is that the provincial and federal government are already taking up that tax room. So, if you just say we're going to keep federal and provincial taxes the same, but also let municipal governments tax a lot more, it's unlikely they actually will do it. It's hard enough to get anybody to approve of new taxes, let alone when you're not offsetting them somewhere else. So you would need to both get municipal government more tools and also have, say the provincial government decide, okay, well, here's, the amount we spend of our capital budget on public transportation. We'll not do that anymore, and we'll reduce taxes by that amount.
Well, that's
a challenging thing to do.
Sorry, I apologize for interrupting. That is part of the problem. When you think about provincial governments demanding more money for healthcare from the federal government, and then turning around and reducing tolls on highways and sticker fees and talking about tax decreases, it's almost as if I want to buy votes by giving back taxes, but then I still need the money. So federal government, give me the money. It's kind of a strange situation, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, everybody wants to spend money, but nobody wants to collect the taxes. So that leads to a situation where, yes, you've got all the premiers saying, hey, Justin Trudeau, you're not giving us enough money for healthcare. And you get the same thing happening at the municipal level with provincial governments. And it's really not a healthy situation. It's better to have, it would be ideally better to have, more taxing power at the local government level, so they don't have to go cap in hand to Queen's Park, let alone Ottawa, to get things done.
One of the other arguments you make in your piece is that staffs of councillors should be increased in resources. Funding for those staff should increase. You separately, just a couple of minutes ago, said that you think that planning decisions should be taken away and that councillors should act more like board members and dealing with overall strategy, not the detailed operational stuff. Wouldn't the money be better spent in better planning departments that can make the decisions at the planning levels, rather than having, I'll use this word derogatorily, I apologize, but lackeys within council members' office being the people that developers had to get approvals from?
Well, I guess the one thing I'd say is that we're talking about pretty small amounts of money. So like a city council office in Toronto, they have $500,000 for staffing, which sounds like a lot until you think about, you have to have like an EA and a secretary, and then, you start adding these up. And also there are caps on the amount they could spend per staff member. There's a lot that they have to do. And if you want city councilors who are really able to perform well and to have a good idea of everything that's going on in the city without burning out, frankly, it's really difficult without being able to have enough staff to, do a lot of the research for them. Especially when you think about councilors sitting into, late night meetings, they're human beings. They need to eat, they need to go home, they need to have a life. So I think having people to do some of the job for them is something that could make it a lot better.
So your bottom line is that the counselors aren't paid enough, that they're not resourced enough, that they don't have enough power over the responsibilities that they've got. They don't have enough influence, control over the responsibilities they've got, which are extensive, given what municipal governments are responsible for. They don't have the taxing power. And if anything, what you're saying is that they need to be close to the people rather than limited in representation, the way that amalgamation and having the size of Toronto City Council caused.
Yeah, I guess I would say that overall the challenge is that they get a lot of the blame, but they have little of the power. And they don't necessarily have the compensation to really make it worthwhile. So I think what we need to do is we need to, make it a good job again, and make sure that they can do their jobs well. And they're not really set up for success at the moment.
We're chatting with Stephen LeFleur, a public policy analyst, about what's wrong with municipal government in Ontario today that's causing far fewer people to run for Toronto City Council. We're going to take a final break. In 2 minutes, we'll be back with some concluding comments. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Stephen LeFleur. He is a public policy analyst. He's recently written a really interesting article in the hub.ca about Toronto City Council having 1/3 less people running, and that indicates that there's a problem with municipal government and the attractiveness of becoming a city council. Stephen, I think we've chatted about this before, but I think it was 1996 or 1997, Ann Golda had a GTA task force that was commissioned by the provincial government. And this was, before the turn of the millennium. So it was, 23, 24, 25 years ago. And at that time, she said, the issues facing Toronto today are of a regional nature, increasingly so, whether they be transit, whether they be housing, whether they be highways, and having the Don Valley Parkway and the Gardiner Expressway funded by Toronto City Council, having TTCs that end at the Toronto border, having people only focused on their own local areas, made sense in the past, but makes no sense today. And she recommended amalgamation, which was implemented by the Harris government, but in only one of the 5 cities that she recommended amalgamation in. She recommended amalgamation in Toronto, but she also recommended amalgamation in Peel, where she said that Mississauga and Brampton should merge. She had said that Caledon potentially was more of a rural town and might actually join the region that it was that is to the north of it. She thought that Halton, Oakville, Burlington, Milton, etc., should merge. That York, Vaughan, Markham, Thornhill, Richmond Hill should merge, and that Durham, Ajax, Whitby, Oshawa should merge, and that together those 4 cities and the City of Toronto should form a new GTA council, sort of comparable to the Metro Toronto Council that existed prior to amalgamation in Toronto, to deal with major issues like transit, highways that go across city boundaries. She argued that it was the right thing to do, but her and Hazel McCallion, who sat on her task force, said no one has got the guts to do it, number one, because everyone likes small. It seems like it makes more sense. And the provincial government won't like it, because then this government will end up being more powerful than the provincial government, because effectively the mayor of this greater Toronto area today is the Premier of Ontario. So I guess I got to ask you, is regional government in all these different towns around Toronto actually the right way to run everything?
Well, I think you just touched on something there. The idea that in some respects the Premier is the mayor of Toronto, and that is a challenge. And so, if you were to have another layer underneath that was responsible for one of the most high-profile portfolios, that would certainly be a very powerful body. I guess part of the challenge is that it's one of those things that on a whiteboard sounds good and might be good, but politically probably won't happen. Especially after amalgamation was a big structural change and didn't really work out the way that anybody had hoped, I think. When you have one big structural change like that and it doesn't work out the way that people hoped, it's really hard to do, other structural changes, especially when there's not a lot of incentive. Because I think that, a lot of provincial politicians are kind of happy with how things are. You get elected to Queen's Park, and that's where the real action is, and you get to make these decisions. I do think that, as you pointed out, there are challenges with having services that cross boundaries. One I would argue positive example, some other people might disagree, to deal with some of these things is Metrolinx, for instance. They have quietly done a good job of building out a lot of interregional transit that, when you look at City Council in Toronto, how difficult it's been to decide, in conjunction with Queen's Park, what to build. The Ontario line, for instance, is arguably decades overdue. The Eglinton crosstown, that could have been built, in the 90s. So when you look at how stagnant a lot of these decisions have been in Ontario, or in Toronto rather, versus a lot of what Metrolinx has accomplished as an independent body, I think that there's something to be said for having a transit organization that thinks more broadly than just the municipal level. Now, some people don't like the fact
that's Ann Johnson's argument effectively, is that when you have the TTC run by the City of Toronto, it only makes decisions and it's in a political realm. And so therefore things like sewage, power, transit, garbage, et cetera, should be done on a more regional basis, because a lot of those things cross city boundaries. And you think about Metrolinx in your example, the Ontario line was never talked about before, never discussed by either the province of Ontario in the what was it called, the Big Move effort that Metrolinx did previously, and the province of Ontario did previously, or anything that the City of Toronto had ever thought about. They had talked about a relief line, but never anything that was anything comparable to the Ontario line. The Ontario line was developed by a consultant working for Metrolinx, developed in the bureaucracy, and announced fait accompli by Premier Ford. There was no political, it was almost as if bureaucracy made the decision, not politics. And I guess you're arguing that that's better.
Well, to be fair, the relief line has been a topic of conversation for decades. It didn't end up being exactly the relief line, but I think the concept was pretty broadly agreed upon, but nobody really saw it in their interest to do it. So I think that Metrolinx, eventually just went ahead and did it, despite some opposition. At the end of the day, you were never going to get a situation where you did it without any opposition. There's always going to be somebody who's mad about it. Like I live in one of the neighborhoods that, will have some displacement that will happen. And, I see the signs, but on the other hand, I also see that I'll be able to get to Union Station in 15 minutes one day. So I think that, having an organization that doesn't just think about people who are going to be, upset about having to rejig a park, is important. And, you brought up the highways. I could live with two situations. I could live with having the ability to toll them, or if we're not going to be allowed to do that, then I think that, the provincial government maybe should consider uploading them. Now, I think we're stuck with kind of a third situation where, the Gardeners half the capital budget for a while in Toronto, even though we can't do what we want with it. So yeah, I think that that's an example of a case where, we should think more regionally, because honestly, the Gardiner Expressway is more oriented towards, or is to a large extent oriented towards people who don't live in the city and aren't paying taxes in the city.
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things that several of my West Toronto friends point out to me all the time is they pay for the Gardiner Expressway, but during rush hours, they're actually blocked from getting on it. And it's kind of an interesting situation. I think this has been a good conversation, Stephen. I really appreciate your article in the hub.ca. I appreciate your public policy analysis. I look forward to chatting with you again. I think, just to finish it off, that we do have a problem with lack of interest. I think in politics generally, the voting participation rates have gone down dramatically in federal and provincial races. I worry that they're going to be incredibly low in this upcoming municipal race. And incumbents will see that as a positive because it's easier for them to get elected and they don't have to spend as much money. I think it's a negative. And I think that we've got to do something to change it. And I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I am convinced that the current system isn't working. I think that city governments haven't built enough housing. There's been way too much red tape. You and I have talked about this previously. It takes too long. They're too influenced by NIMBYism in their local community. And so I do think that whether it be political parties or less council members and having the number of council members, maybe voting them in at large, like you've indicated other cities have, and or implementing that vision from 1996, 1997 that Ann Jansen had of regional government that's different. Because I think regional government instituted by, I think it was the Davis government, 50 years ago, I think it's sort of seen its day in the Greater Toronto Area. It might be completely reasonable in Bracebridge, but not anymore in Greater Toronto Area. Anyway, that's our show for tonight. Stephen LeFleur, thank you so much for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online from any different city in the Greater Toronto Area at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.